Our keynote today is by Joe Nick Petoskey, and I'm so excited about this. Take a moment to glance at his ample bio on our website. It runs 4 very long paragraphs, so I'm not going to summarize that there. Suffice to say that Joe Nick has done it all, from driving a cab to writing for Texas Monthly, to hosting radio shows to filming documentaries, including his recent piece, Sir Doug and the Genuine Texas Cosmic Groove, which we saw in Houston a couple weeks ago at the Brazil Cafe. If you didn't have a chance to see it, it was kick-ass. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present Joe Nick Petoskey.
Man, if you're looking for action, man, Houston's a town. They got women folk walking down the street, boy, flagging the men folks down. Boy, you know Houston, man, it's an action town.
Welcome to the Action Town, y'all. Duke Boy Bonner right there doing the testifying, and I was lucky enough back in 1974 to spend a day with the music producer Huey P. Moe, and at the end of the day, Huey took me to downtown to the KPFT studios where he did his radio show, The Crazy Cajun Show, which beamed out. He was really targeting the men and women in white in the Texas Department of Corrections who could all tune in. Huey had done time, and he didn't forget the people that were doing time. So he had this great prisoners radio show with some of the wildest music I ever heard, and Juke Boy Bonner wandering in off the street, coming to pay his respects, because that's what Juke Boy did. And that one day and night was my introduction to what I consider the Action Town. I'm the outsider here tonight, y'all, or today. I'm not of here. I'm not of Houston. But I've sure been watching it for a good part of my adult life because music is my thing, and that's our thing today. But before we get started, I want to ask a kind of a related question. What does Houston taste like? Any idea? What's Houston flavor? I mean, if you could eat it, what's Houston? Because after doing what I've been doing for over 45 years, I can now say the easiest way to understand and appreciate any culture is to eat it. You don't have to know the language. You don't have to know anything about it. But if it tastes good, you might want to know a little bit more about it. And that's really, kind of the direct entree. If you might want to know what the ingredients are, or you don't have to know what the manners are. But if it tastes good and you like it, you're on your way to understanding a culture. So what does Houston taste like? Is it flavored? Is there spice to it? Jalapenos involved? Does it come with a roux, a salsa, peanut sauce? It's definitely heavily spiced, and it should contain shrimp, oysters, blue crab, redfish, beef brisket, short ribs, collard greens, kale, and probably be slow smoked on post oak or possibly deep fried, served on a banh mi roll or in a noodle bowl, and come with extra pecans and raisins, or maybe be accompanied by fries or boudin balls, and finished off with pralines or sherbet, your choice. It may be something on the menu of Reef over here at Tony's, but my guess is you'd be more likely to find whatever Houston tastes like cruising Bissonnette, where you can eat the world. And that whatever you were going to taste, whatever Houston tastes like, it's inexpensive and filling. Is it a James Coney Island dog? Prince's Burger? See, we're on a pretty slippery slope already, and we haven't even got to what we're talking about here today, and that's music. The other easy way to dive into a culture, and really the way I've been diving into cultures most of my life. If something sounds good, you should be able to want to hear more. And again, if you really love music, if music draws you in, language shouldn't be a barrier if the groove and melody are sturdy enough. That's how I began my visitations into other cultures, courtesy of the radio growing up in Fort Worth, Texas, listening to KNOK Soul Power, which was my KCOH or KYOK, and my entree into the world of blues, rhythm and blues, soul, jazz, the black music experience. But it didn't stop there. Radio is how I started appreciating honky-tonk music. My parents were definitely not hillbillies. They were both immigrants, first and second generation immigrants to the United States, and they weren't of Texas. So that was, hillbilly music was actually something exotic to me. It wasn't native or natural. And it's the same thing with Texas Mexican music, which starting to scan the dial, and after a while learning a little bit about Latin music in general, this is not like any other Latin music. There was a bounce and rhythm to the music that you didn't hear in other sounds. Never mind that the vocals were sung in Spanish and I didn't have a very good grasp of Spanish. When I peeled away the layers, I started to learn about polka being the root of conjunto, which is really the cantina, the soulful Texas Mexican sound. And I learned that, it's done with accordions and bajo sexto, a 12-string guitar that provides rhythm like nowhere else. It's indigenous to South Texas. And I learned that unlike everywhere else, every other kind of Latin music in the United States, which the basic beat is the cumbia, in Texas it was the polka, because Texas Mexicans appropriated the polka from listening to Czechs and German and Polish immigrants at dances and taking what I really consider to be a constipated Central European sound. And it is old European polka is constipated. And what the Texas Mexicans did was pep it up and put kick into it and make it wholly danceable and engaging for someone that had no idea what they were talking about or where this culture was coming from. It drew me in. And I think about it today, that what separates Texas and Houston in particular from everywhere else is if Houston is part of the South, it's the only place in the South where it's tri-ethnic, not bi-ethnic. The southern United States is Anglo-American and African-American. Houston in Texas is Anglo-American, African-American, and Mexican-American. And once you start traveling west, anywhere west of here, you lose that African-American influence. This is tri-ethnic, and it really makes all the difference in the world and establishes what I consider to be the most diverse musical sounds in America, which makes this a glorious mess that's hard to pin down. And, we say Mexican-Americans, but when I say that and you want to break it down in Texas, am I talking about Chicanos or Norteños or Mexicanos or Tejanos or Pochos? And are we talking about, when we say Mexican, is it puro sangre, real pure Spanish blood, or mestizo or indio? Every group has its nuances. And within black culture here, it's not just black culture. Here there's the strong Creole influence, and there's all these different variations between, educated class and working class, and skin color puts a social status on you. And it's the same thing. You could say Anglos are Anglos. Oh, white folks are white folks. But which white folks? Are we talking about the settlers, the colonists that came over from the southern United States during the Republic of Texas' early founding? Or are we talking about the Polish, Czech, and German immigrants who flooded into Texas, into Indianola and Galveston, and really defined this state? The first Polish settlers into the United States came into Texas first. But those are white folks. So every group, you can't draw with a broad brush. It's like you start drilling down, it's like, boy, there is nuance upon nuance. And, how do you factor this in? And that raises the bigger question. How do you take all these different sounds and flavors and create a whole meal, a whole sound, and call it the soul of Houston? It is deep, it's rich, but as it seems like in so many instances regarding all things Houston, it is diffuse and lacking a sense of connectivity. Which leads to a lot of other questions. Are DJ Screws, Screwed and Chopped style, is that part of a lineage established by the punchy horn charts devised by Joe Scott for Junior Parker and Bobby Bland at Duke Peacock? Maybe. There is some kind of connection between Don Roby and James Smith of Rap-A-Lot Records and Matthew Knowles Beyonce's father and one-time manager, and a distinct thread that ties Pappy Daly to Bill Ham of ZZ Top, with a side trip through psychedelic music, courtesy of international artists in the 13th floor elevators in Red Crayola. And strangely, those things were a direct influence on the artist who would become Kenny Rogers. Figure that one out, folks. It doesn't make sense. And similarly, the singer-songwriters, the folkies that really matured here and kind of fermented here in the 1960s, like Mickey Newberry, the composer of that song, What Condition My Condition Is In, Townes Van Zandt, Guy Clark, Nancy Griffith, Eric Taylor, Lyle Lovett, Vince Bell, people like that, and there's a lot of them. They had role models in Lightnin' Hopkins and, to a lesser extent, his cousin Mance Lipscomb over there in Navasota, who were bluesmen that had been discovered by the folk music audience nationally. And they were the elders of a very rich scene that continues to this very day. What started in the 1940s and 1950s with Mance and Lightnin', that's still playing out right now. It's not playing out in obvious ways, but it's there. And how about all these ancillary players that never get credit? The infrastructure that really made this city and gave it a sound, the producers and promoters and talent scouts, booking agents, engineers, studio operators, composers, arrangers, song publishers, managers, radio disc jockeys, distributors, pressing plants, jukebox operators, record labels, designers, club owners, street teams, dance hall operators, barkeeps. All those elements are part of the Houston musical soul as far as I'm concerned. And you wrap it up all together into one, all these things I've been talking about. To me, I mean, you look at the whole, that's an action town. I mean, that's just no lie, no brag, just fact. You know, there we go. That's the action town. I mean, you know, real shiny and all that. But the real action, the guy that makes that song, he's from the street. He's funky, he's ragged, and he's right. I mean, that's Juke Boy Bonner. Now, tri-ethnic. I talked about that stool. It's three of them. It's white folks, it's black folks, it's brown folks. And Houston's had them all since before the beginning of recorded music. And recorded music is very important because it's the one thing we've got. I mean, it's that one element. You can't argue with a recording when it was made in the 20s. You know what it sounds like. We could speculate what music sounded like beforehand, before it was recorded, but we don't have that record. And that's what keeps us chasing, and records are the first real document that can tell us what was, so we can start going on our adventure and going finding out what this is all about. That's the Mendoza family. And I got to say, I mean, I've started figuring out Houston's a mess. It's a glorious mess trying to figure out the music, but there are some commonalities here. And one thing that I figured out early on is early Houston music, the Houston recorded music in the 20s and 30s, more than anything, it was a matriarchy. The women were the ones that really ruled, starting with the Mendoza family. And we don't talk about the Mexican-American experience near as much as the African-American or Anglo-American experience, and maybe because there's not a written history. But one of the first stars to come out of Houston, recording stars, was Lydia Mendoza, recording for Bluebird Records. And people would have associated her with South Texas. She was the Lark of the Border, and of San Antonio. She's from Houston, and Houston needs to own up on it. And certainly people like Victoria Spivey, Sippy Wallace, and Geeshie Wiley, L.V. Thomas. These are women, and they were the first recording stars, and we'll get to Geeshie and L.V. a little bit later. People thought until recently they were from Mississippi. They didn't know that they were from Houston. And they were recording stars in the 1930s, and Houston didn't know well enough to claim them then. But it wasn't just back then, early recorded music wasn't just a black deal or a brown deal. The white folks did pretty well too, including Smokey Woods and his Modern Mountaineers, one of my favorite swing bands of all, who did really kind of dirty music in a way. Ted Daffin, who wrote the first truck driving song, Truck Driver's Blues. And of course, Floyd Tillman, who did wonders. His song Slippin' Around was considered the classic of all cheating songs and the standard by which all cheating songs are judged by. And of course, Action Town meant live music shows like the Grand Prize Hoedown Jamboree, which was downtown in the new air-conditioned Eagles Hall at 2204 Louisiana, just up the road. And don't you think air conditioning meant something back in the 1940s and 50s? And there is Houston's first rhythm and blues recording star, and maybe first rock star even, because he was one of the big three of Houston jump blues rockers, along with Gory Carter and Big Walter Price, who I consider to be the fathers of not just Texas rock and roll, but arguably all rock and roll, long before rock and roll was called rock and roll. And it's significant. Amos is of Houston, but he recorded in Los Angeles. He was discovered by a woman named Lola Mae Cullum, again, a matriarchy. What was a female talent scout doing, finding the best talent in Houston and shipping them off to L.A. where they became discovered? And Lola Mae actually had her own record label, artist record company. She was the wife of a dentist, but again, women in a male-dominated scene. Popular music has been dominated by males. In Houston, women played an important critical role early on, as they continue to do to this very day. And there he is, Gory Carter, who many consider to be the first rocker of them all. And he recorded for Freedom Records. Gory Carter and his Hepcats, and this recording here is considered, some will say, is the first rock and roll record. I'm not going to try to split hairs or anything. It just sounds real good, and that's all you need to know. And there is Clarence Gatemouth Brown, T-Bone Walker disciple, who was discovered at the Bronze Peacock nightclub, slipping in while T-Bone was taking a break. And the owner of the Bronze Peacock nightclub, Don Roby, was so smitten with Gatemouth, not only did he start managing him, he ended up closing up his nightclub and building a record empire. The Bronze Peacock, Clarence Gatemouth Brown, and the Bronze Peacock was a sophisticated nightclub for all y'all. Most of y'all would know what it was, but in 1945 it opened up in the 5th Ward of Houston and brought sophistication and really elegance into blues music. And it wasn't just a nice nightclub with a gambling casino out back and nice food, but it was the entertainment that they brought convinced Don Roby to quit what he was doing. And again, matriarchy. Don Roby, he was the guy he was the businessman whose name was behind Duke and Peacock Records and built the biggest empire ever to come out of Houston. Evelyn Johnson is the alleged secretary and really the brains of the operation, who learned the business and basically was the person, the go-between Roby, who was not necessarily a very nice or amiable person. Evelyn was the one that dealt with the acts and also headed up the Buffalo Booking Agency, which was the biggest booking agency on the Chitlin Circuit in the United States. The Bells of Joy from Austin were one of the first bands that Roby had a hit with, a gospel group. And Roby was not just the businessman, but he was also the guy that put drums, added the beat into gospel music in his earliest recordings for Peacock Records. He followed that with he was getting hits on Willie Mae Thornton, who had a big hit with Hound Dog 4 years before Elvis did. This is coming out of Houston. And of course, there is Johnny Ace, who blew his brains out on Christmas night during Negro Appreciation Night at the City Coliseum backstage playing Russian roulette. At the time, Johnny Ace had been a Memphian who had moved to Houston working for Duke Records, and he was basically, among black society, he was Elvis already. He was a crooner, he was a sensation, and probably might have been even the black Elvis and recognized had he not unfortunately killed himself on Christmas night, 1954. And of course, Roby then became famous as the first real record czar to cash in on a death. No one had done this before, and multiple Johnny Ace memorial recordings began their releases then. And there's nothing like a dead artist to promote, because they're not going to talk back to you. Roby created not just a sound with horns and a very sophisticated sound. He created a look. He dressed up his acts in tuxedos and cocktail gowns and basically made black music, took it uptown, as evidenced by Little Junior Parker and his song Driving Wheel. But it was like Cadillacs and nice homes. And of course, This cover here, photographed in Houston, Bobby Blue Bland, the ladies' pet, the boys' fret, standing, looking very confident on his way inside. This is Uptown, baby. And Don Robey was basically elevating black music and black society in a way that no one had done before, and was doing this 10 years before Motown rolled around. He had many singers, including the great Mildred Jones and Miss Lavelle, who's still singing to this very day. He had artists like Larry Davis, who recorded this little single on Duke called Texas Flood in 1983. A kid comes along from Austin named Stevie Ray Vaughan and has a pretty good role with that song. And of course, Evelyn Johnson ran Buffalo Booking Agency, this is a vertically integrated business, basically. They have a pressing plant, they have a studio, and dig it. Don Robey was a gangster. He gave up a gambling casino and running a liquor store for opening a record label and opening a record shop. He bet big on music at a time when music was a better bet than a roulette wheel, and bought in, and for a reason. Because Buffalo Booking Agency didn't just represent Duke Peacock acts, they had B.B. King. Houston was where the musicians were. B.B. King came to Houston to put his band together. Ray Charles put his band together in Houston. And of course, the flip side of all this, the sophistication, elegance, and dressing up, was the root. And here is the poet laureate of the state of Texas, Sam Lightnin' Hopkins, who rambled all around the Third Ward and basically would jump on buses to busk, play on the streets, would play anywhere, but was recognized nationally and internationally, and really was so much of a motivation for putting Houston on the musical map, as much as Duke Peacock, easily. And this recording, Lightnin' recorded for a guy named Bill Quinn, who is one of two electronic geniuses in Houston. Most cities were lucky enough to have one, like Jim Beck in Dallas was a genius. Here you had Bill Quinn and you had Bill Holford, who both were tinkerers that started recording studios in the 1940s. And Quinn actually started it, he thought it was going to be a hillbilly label. He ended up getting hits with Lightnin' Hopkins and others in the race record field, and had the very first Cajun hit with Harry Schultz, Jolie Blonde. Another big act that Quinn had early on Gold Star Records, recording at Gold Star Studios rather, was this guy here, and I consider him the king of Zydeco music, another indigenous form of Houston music. That's Clifton Chenier, who is so intricately connected to Houston back and forth, even though he was born in Louisiana and died in Louisiana. He was definitely of Texas, and I have never seen live music as intense or as mighty or as tore down or made me sweat so much as getting to see Clifton multiple times. Now, this is typical of Houston, too. Hop Wilson here. The great thing about Houston is there's not many rules or regulations or zoning or traditions. So what was a black guy doing playing a lap steel, which is traditionally an instrument associated with hillbillies? He was making music that sounded good. Nothing to it. Houston's famous for its guitar sound. Albert Collins, the Iceman, Johnny Guitar Watson, Johnny Clyde Copeland, and people like Clarence Holloman. It's famous for its Texas tenor community, starting with Illinois Jack Kett, Arnett Cobb, I.J. Smalley, and Smalley's band. I mean, it was a big band sound, and the horns that really emerged in Houston in the 1950s, especially through Duke Peacock recordings, had as distinctive a sound in America, and are recognized by scholars. It's as distinctive a sound as New Orleans horns in the really from the 20s, 30s, 40s into the 50s. Houston's persevered longer and still perseveres. The great Jewel Brown, who came out of Houston and recorded first for Duke Records and went on to play with Earl Gardner in LA for a while, and then she hooked in with Louis Armstrong, probably the biggest act in jazz, and she became a singer and appeared on television with him multiple times. Grady Gaines, who backed up Little Richard, who actually was in Houston before he became a star. Don Robey was so upset seeing Little Richard when he was with the Tempo Tossers and they weren't making any money. And Little Richard was so broke while he was in Houston, he ended up selling catfish. Well, the story is Robey saw him selling catfish on the street. Some guy was giving him catfish to sell, and he had it in a basket. Roby pulled over, stopped his car, and got out and grabbed a catfish out of the basket and slapped Little Richard with it and said, "None of my artists sell catfish," and got back in his car and drove away. Grady Gaines, and still playing today, and a star in his own right. I didn't realize this till recently that around Houston for a while he was known as Pretty Grady Gaines after he left Little Richard. The great Conrad Johnson, who is known for the Kashmir Stage Band and all that he's done as a musical educator, but was also the leader of the band Connie's Combo, who did a lot of recordings in Houston in the 50s and 60s. And here are the great jazz crusaders who came out of Houston and basically forged what is considered the soul, funk, jazz fusion sound. Most of it was articulated in recordings done out in LA, but it all started here. And radio played a very important part in exposing people, as it always has. Radio is a medium, but you got to understand, in Houston, it was also things like jukeboxes. And typical, Pappy Daly was the jukebox czar of the great Southwest. He became that by writing the Bally Jukebox Company in Chicago asking, "Who's distributing your product in this area?" And he got a letter back saying, "Well, you are if you want to." And he took that and seized it. Mexican-American bands were already integrating traditional musics like the bajo and like the accordion in with a bigger band sound, and became really as smitten with rhythm and blues and rock and roll as anyone was. And I think the peak was Jesse Villanueva and the Rockin' V's, an early 60s band here in Houston, were joined together by producer Huey Moe with Sonny Ozuna, who had a band called the Sun Glows in San Antonio. And together they formed Sonny and the Sunliners. One player from San Antonio conveyed the keyboardist Arturo Sas Gonzalez. But this is the first band, the first Mexican-American band to appear on American Bandstand on television, really validating the Mexican-American experience. It came from here, folks. And of course, it also comes from here. These are the joints, really, and when you get down to the soul of Houston, I'll argue it's these little bitty clubs where people are making music, no matter what ethnic background you are or who you're playing to. But these are what I call, these are really the labs where it all comes from. And of course, you know, dances remain important. They always have been. Hillbillies have always had a big representation. And my theory is, if not for oil, Houston should have been Nashville. And I'm about to prove it. But it also should have been Memphis and Detroit all at the same time. And because all this was going on. People like Eddie Nowak, who remains famous today for his the song that he was written by Leon Payne that he was the first to cover, called Psycho, which is one of the most twisted songs in the history of music, not just country. And of course, there is Blind Leon Payne, the father of country music, Hank Williams, and Jerry Irby, Houstonian, Houston star. And you know, Houston was part of the backdrop for many, many artists. Texas Bill Strength, your F&M ranch hand on Kay Lee. And, you know, there's old Pappy Daly right there with Gabe Tucker, who moved to Houston after working with Elvis. But Pappy Daly is a giant. He started Star Day Records and then started D Records. He is the guy that not only discovered, but also produced George Jones and brought him to the world. George Jones, in case you don't know, is the greatest voice in country music. And for all you fine art connoisseurs, he may be the greatest voice, period. I'd put him up against any of those Italian tenors. And there's Bill Holford right there of ACA Records. And I like that we've talked about this. Roger Wood pointed out, we were talking the other day about segregation and how music really didn't know barriers. Black and white and brown, yeah, legally on the street, that might have meant a difference and you're supposed to be here and there. When it came to music, those barriers dropped. And the one place that knew no color was a recording studio. They took them all on. And jukeboxes. This is what made Pappy Daly a star, because jukeboxes were making hits all the way through the mid-1950s, long before radio was, and Houston was one of the global hubs of jukeboxes. There's Sonny Burns, who is a guy, he was the star for Star Day Records, And he got loaded one day and didn't show up for a recording session. And that's when this guy stepped right in and did Why Baby Why with the Jones Boys. That's George Jones. And, you know, here's a Houston star who really didn't quite convey beyond here. And he was on the Gulf Coast Jamboree, Utah Carl. And I just love it because everybody's got a look. And then here's two guys that were, they were in a backing band that were recording in Houston in 1952. These two guys here, this guy in the middle is Johnny Bush, who comes from Kashmir Gardens, is going to be speaking later on today. And here's Johnny's good buddy, running buddy. They were both in San Antonio at the time, a guy named Willie Hugh Nelson, who's just getting the start. And that was Willie's first go-round in Houston. He came back by later on, and God bless Willie when he did that, because you know, it was a tough time for him. He was broke. He had a family. He had a bunch of songs, and you know, he came to Houston the second time around, 1959, late in '59. He hired on with Larry Butler's band at the Esquire Ballroom. He got part-time work as a disc jockey. He taught guitar at Paul Buskirk's music store. He cut some tracks at Gold Star Studios, including Nightlife, and he was under contract to D Records, but Pappy Daly thought Nightlife sounded too colored, so he wouldn't release it. So Willie, on the sly, released it under the label of Paul Buskirk and his Merry Men, featuring Hugh Nelson, using his middle name, and it kind of got him heard. And he also started selling songs for $50 a pop. He was desperate. One song he sold for $50 a pop was to this guy, Claude Gray, who was a Houston disc jockey, and he had a hit with it on a song called Family Bible. And that hit is what got Willie to thinking, I better go to Nashville and let people know who really wrote that song. And, of course, the rest is history. Houston was happening when Houston was a space city, and I don't think there was any better representative, and it continues to the day. Hi, everybody. We're Archie Bell and the Drells from Houston, Texas, and we can sing and dance as good as we want or as good as we walk. Let's argue that point. But Archie Bell and the Drells were managed by radio disc jockey Skipper Lee Frazier. Black music was strong enough in Houston to merit 2 black stations, unlike most other cities that only had 1 if you were lucky. And so y'all were spoiled way back when. And the nice thing is, although the program was aimed at a black audience, you know, and there's old Skipper Lee there at work with 2 of his fans. But what the great thing about this is, it's like people like me could listen to Groovy George and Skipper Lee and also win prizes on the station. I mean, this was a black station, but white folks were listening too and winning prizes. And that's the Houston experience. We're jumping boundaries all the dang time. Local Johnny Nash was the very first artist to have a reggae hit on the radio. No one had heard of reggae music. And shortly afterwards, people started hearing about Jimmy Cliff and Bob Marley and all that. It was a Houston guy that brought reggae to the United States. And then, you know, Saturday night in Houston, Larry Butler, Willie Nelson, Jimmy Heat, George Jones and the Jones Boys, and over here, Gene Thomas, one of my favorites, and Bud and the Hooper Twins. I mean, that's Houston. Radio, like I said, really did help sell music. And in Houston in the 1960s, nothing like KILT, including Russ Knight, the Weird Beard, and Chuck Dunaway, one of my favorites. And Chuck Dunaway was telling me stories about Don Roby. And I was asking him about Roby, and he said, yeah, he carried guns. I asked him once, I was in his office at his desk, and he had his holster right behind his desk. And I said, what's that? And he said, that's my royalty distributor. Not just radio, but TV was a great medium, especially in the 1960s. There was old Larry Kane, who sold like rock and roll and the Houston sound to all of Houston. Of course, there were venues like the infamous Bamboo Hut, where you could see the Boogie Kings. They were from Louisiana and Southeast Texas, but they were Houston too. Blue Eyed Soul. And of course, you know, there were go-go places and, you know, young adult clubs. And there were bands. I mean, you know, it was like, this is a look. And there were actually serious places like Jimmy Menudas is where not only did he bring in great road acts, I remember Augie Meyer told me he rode his Allstate motor scooter all the way from San Antonio at 40 miles an hour so he could see Jimmy Reed here. But he brought up a whole generation of musicians. And then this guy on the right here, that's Huey P. Moe, the Crazy Cajun, who along with Don Roby and Pappy Daly was one of the great operators and really helped put Houston on the map, for better or for worse. The guy on the left here is Doug Somm, who for years had been trying to bug Huey after Sonny Ozuna had a big hit with Talk to Me. Doug Sahm kept coming from San Antonio to Huey trying to work with him because he knew Huey was a way to get the hits. And Huey was like, bring me a hit, bring me a hit. Huey finally figured out the way to do it was not do R&B or country music, but try to be like the Beatles, who were big at the time. So this guy was repackaged as British, the Sir Douglas Quintet, and they had a big hit with She's About a Mover. They were outed on the television show Hullabaloo as being from Texas. But here's a pretty good gig in Port Arthur. You got the Sir Douglas Quintet through Huey, no doubt, Mickey Gilley, up-and-comer, Dwayne Yates from the Boogie Kings, and many others. Now, in the middle of all this, about the same time Huey has a big pop hit with She's About a Mover and the Sir Douglas Quintet, within the year, you've got this band recording at Gold Star, what becomes Sugar Hill Studios, the 13th Floor Elevators. And they record an album, The Psychedelic Sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators, and have a single, You're Gonna Miss Me. This is the very first psychedelic band anywhere. They ended up going to San Francisco, and they landed there in time for the Summer of Love. They had already made hits and already recorded in Houston. Psychedelic music didn't come from San Francisco. It came from here. This is crazy. So, and here's the Fever Tree. I mean, they had to, they were a Houston band. They didn't go to San Francisco. They just sung about it and had a pop hit called San Francisco Girls. And then there was this band called The Coachmen. And this is typical, like, frat band, R&B band. And this band, The Coachmen, their leader, Bill Gibbons, told me a story recently. He said they actually auditioned for Duke Records. And they were talking about this big kind of gangster-type figure that listened to him. And they said, no, this doesn't feel right. So instead, they changed their names to the Moving Sidewalks because they wanted to be like the psychedelic 13th Floor Elevators. They had a few records, and then they became a band called ZZ Top. And now ZZ Top's important to note that Bill Ham, their manager and brain trust, who basically imagined this band and guarded their image just fiercely, and was really an operator, learned everything he learned from Pappy Daly because he was a salesperson at H.W. Daly record distributors. Bill Ham, and this band is continuing. They started in 69, 70. I want you to just step back and tell me how many rock bands today are still the original lineup, not replaced, the three same guys, and are out there working today. And, I mean, seriously, you can't, they may be on one hand, I can't count them. But what they've achieved is, and what Bill Ham achieved, is off the charts. And, of course, Houston is also about unrecognized heroes like, and this is Frank Davis, who not only was really kind of the great unrecognized operator in the folk music community, he also engineered the 13th Floor Elevator sessions, just like this guy, Guy Clark, one of the greatest singer-songwriters to emerge out of the Houston scene, also did album art for International Artist Record Label and was a graphics designer for a television station here. Everybody wore different hats and everything bled over. So the guy that, you associate with Desperados Waiting for the Train knows all you need to know, or actually did the visuals for bands like the Elevators. This is pretty crazy. And of course, one of the best known, maybe the best known singer-songwriter of all, he came from Fort Worth, but Houston is where he really came of age, and that's Townes Van Zandt. And, it's not just the players, it's places like Anderson Fair, which still exists today, which should have been gone and torn down 30 years ago. The fact that it's there and institutions like that and touchstones, our legacy, Houston's legacy, remains strong through things like that. Nancy Griffith wouldn't be Nancy Griffith. She was born in Austin, but you talk to her and she is of Houston. And there's Doug Sahm with, on stage, you can't see him very well, but El Bebop Kid, Freddie Fender, had a second career thanks to his recordings with Huey Moe in Houston in the 1970s. Recycling Rhythm and Blues is country western, and of course, the urban cowboy phenomenon. I'm not so sure I'd claim that one, because it was a New York writer, Aaron Latham, wrote an article in Esquire magazine, and it became a movie starring John Travolta, who's not of here. But it did kind of make Mickey Gilley and his namesake nightclub over there in Pasadena famous, and the whole idea of Gillies remains sort of famous, but that's maybe one for all the wrong reasons, folks. That's my opinion. And then here's this guy, an IBM salesman, who's pulling down 6 figures, and he kind of chucks it all because he really thinks his daughter's singing group's really going to be something, and he drops everything, and he spends a couple years rehearsing them and really trying to nurture them to get on Star Search, a TV show, and they don't win. But you know what? Destiny's Child ends up becoming much more successful than any Star Search winner there is, period. And of course, that leads to, I mean, Houston's modern era really begins, in my mind, with the Ghetto Boys, Rap-A-Lot Records, and what James Prince started, and basically putting a Houston spin on what's considered rap or hip-hop music. And then this guy here is what, if Houston has a sound today, I'd say it's got to be screwed and chopped, but I'm not a lean drinker, so I don't know that I can get in the head to appreciate it, but the whole idea of turning down music and making it slowed down, that's DJ Screw. And what kind of brilliance, again, in the Houston do-it-yourself spirit, what he would do is hand copy cassettes, and when he's ready to sell them every Friday evening, cars would be lined up in front of his house, and he would sell direct to each person. The cars came not just from Houston, but from all over Texas, because they wanted the latest screwed and chopped sound. And of course, radio again, Houston wouldn't be Houston, and Houston hip-hop wouldn't be on the map, and I think known nationally as a sound unto itself, without radio. And Mad Hatter, I give total credit for breaking local music. Unlike most other radio stations where it's got to be a national programmer, he could suss out Houston music and the Houston sound and exposed it. And again, the ancillary, there's a Houston look to Houston hip-hop, and that's all the 2 guys over at Pen and Pixel who figured out Photoshop and made a whole look out of just Photoshop and bling, and that's a Houston, that's a Pen and Pixel look. Pen and Pixel looks unlike anywhere else, and all throughout hip-hop, nationally and globally, Pen and Pixel is much desired. You really want them to do your artwork. And of course, Paul Wall has not just given hip-hop a multi-ethnic, multicultural look. He brought grills into prominence, and H-Town high fashion is grills like nowhere else. But it doesn't stop there. Chingo Bling has taken the same thing, hip-hop, and he's put a Latin American spin on it, and definitely a Mexican-American immigrant spin on it. And I loved it. When I went and visited him back in the 1990s when he was starting out, I learned he was a marketing major at Trinity University. And folks, when I say that, marketing, I hate using marketing, but he figured out how to sell himself. And that's an underlying theme here. Of course, the biggest show that Selena Quintanilla ever had was at the Astrodome shortly before her death. And it was really, it was a high water mark of Tejano music. No one had ever drawn like that. No one had ever come across the world. She was selling hundreds of thousands of units, only to be cut down tragically shortly afterwards. But, here's the guys that don't get the credit then. This is Houston Tejano sound, except La Mafia transcended Tejano long ago and were Latin international. They went for a global market. And again, self-contained, their own operation, their own recording studio, and their own brains behind the operation in Mondo Lichtenberger. And what he did with these guys and the way that they persisted, La Mafia deserves more credit than they've ever really gotten as far as I'm concerned. And then, of course, here's a traditional sound. Fito Olivares is of Houston, and he plays nothing but cumbias, which, again, is kind of the global Latino sound today. He grew up on the border down just west of Brownsville. He's lived his adult life in Houston, and in the 1990s, I saw him play 2 gigs in Houston in one night. He played a Northside Ballroom gig and played a gig at Navigation Street, drawing over 1,000 people at each gig. Fito Olivares, he's of Houston, but no one knows him. Juana La Cabana is probably a good song to start with. But, and here's the mysterious Jandek, considered the most elusive person in music by many record collectors, and he's a guy here in Houston. And of course, Zydeco, you can't get any, you got folks like Step Rideau and Little Brian and his Zydeco Trailers, J. Paul Jr., and Houston also has a Texas Accordion Kings and Queens the first Saturday of every June at Miller Outdoor Amphitheater, which have been lucky enough to co-host. And I love this event because it's the only place that you'll hear people singing in English, Spanish, French, Polish, German, and Czech. And that all these people are singing while they're all being accompanied by accordions, and people are dancing down in front, all these different ethnic groups, and they're all dancing the same steps in the same direction. That's Houston in a nutshell. And you can say, a lot of people say, well, this is a guitar town or a horn town. Man, this is an accordion town. C.J. Chenier, who lives in Houston, the son of Clifton Chenier, and he takes Zydeco around the world, but he's based in Houston. His rubboard player, Juanito Castillo, who is the heir apparent of Rio Jordan, Esteban Jordan's band from San Antonio. This is Houston. Creole, Zydeco, conjunto, music. It's all together. And Mickey Sus Carnales. It isn't just a boys' game. This is the matriarchy here. And, of course, there's the old umbrella man, Nick Gaitan, and who's going to be here speaking. Jason Moran, who's now the musical director at the Lincoln Center in New York City, replacing Wynton Marsalis. From Houston, Texas. The Suffers, who you may have seen in all these commercials about Houston, trying to sell Houston. And Little Joe Washington, who was of Houston as much as anyone, and of Houston Street more than anyone. And, of course, you can't talk Houston without the biggest female act in entertainment, period. And I just drove past her headquarters here on my way to this gig, and I didn't, I know where the headquarters are, but anyone else driving past it, they don't know that this is the home of the biggest act, a female act in show business. And then I'm wrapping up here with back to Geeshie and Elvie, who recorded in 1930, and this guy here who passed away this last year, Mac McCormick. And Mac was not born in Houston, but Houston was his place, and he did the kind of research that's invaluable. In fact, no single person has accumulated the body of knowledge in American roots music like McCormick did. Only no one knows what's really in it because his archive, the monster, has yet to be gone through and accessioned. But Mac did this not because he was an academic, not because his job required it. He did it in spite of his work. He did it because it really burned something deep inside. He wanted to know more about it. And I love the fact he was a census taker for a while because that was one way he could determine why so many barrel house piano players came from a certain part of Houston. I mean, that's the kind of work he did. And he spun off some proteges. And I consider people like Roger Wood here today a protege. Certainly Andrew Brown, who did not come today, and I wish he had it because he's doing the kind of independent research that really matters, as well as people that are academics and professionals and have reasons to research like me when I want to do books or articles and things like that. But Mac did it just because he needed to, and he wanted to learn more. And you know what, folks? When I drill down deep, that's the musical soul of Houston. All these various people making music, they are the collective soul, but it's the translators and those that are going to be empowering themselves or trying to empower others to tell their stories and to keep telling those stories. I'm nothing but a translator. I'm not Willie Nelson. I've written a pretty good book about him, though. I'm not the Dallas Cowboys, and I think I've written more about them than needs to be written about them. And it goes the same with Selena or Stevie Ray Vaughan. But you are in the same position. You are translators too. And many of you know the stories. If you're people that just, I am the story, I have the story to tell. There's people here who are the ones to hear it. And I'm going to make the argument you're the musical soul of Houston. You people here because you care enough about it that you want to tell the story. And it really is, I hate saying it, marketing, but when I came to Austin in 1973, no one was talking about Texas music or an Austin music scene. And today it's like second nature. And it's just a matter of recognizing, honoring it, and saying it over and over.
this is a much deeper story than Austin's music history. This is the deepest story of all, at least in this part of the world. And it's continual. And it doesn't stop with the tri-ethnic. It continues with, African high life music and Vietnamese pop music. All these sounds, there's sounds. The thing about Houston is you got to lift up the rug. It's not obvious right now. There is not a go-to place. It's not like Nashville when you can go straight to the Country Music Hall of Fame or go see the George Jones Museum or the Johnny Cash Museum. You can touch it. You can't touch it here. You got to you lift up the rug and you got to start looking. But boy, once you do, if you take that effort to lift up just the world that's here, and Zydeco is not a dead musical form. Conjunto is not a defunct folk sound. These are living folk musics. And if you want to go hear it, go to Gabinelli Accordions over there in Southwest Houston on some Saturday like today and go watch. And you'll see black kids, white kids, and brown kids all working out different accordions that are made for their music. And you see that this thing's going on. It's not stopping. What it's going to take, though, is people to keep telling that story. And we can do, all of us, and I say we collectively because I'm zoning in here, and I've only gotten through part of Andrew Brown's interviews with Mac McCormick at the U of H Special Collection. I've got a couple more days yet. I've already spent a few days in there going through his files, which are wonderful, but Andrew Brown asking Mac McCormick question. I'm sorry Mac McCormick's dead and gone, but I can't wait for people to start going through what he's found so we can share it with people. Because what happened here was incredibly important. What happened here is incredibly important. And you're the reason why. And you're the reason you want to wring your hands. Why isn't Houston this or that? And why aren't people talking about it? No, it's up to y'all. And you're going to be the reason why people start talking about it and to make it second nature. So what does Houston sound like? It's a glorious, delicious mess. You want to call it a stew or a gumbo? I don't know. But I put together a little mashup, and here's my best guess if we can do it. Here's what I think Houston sounds like, but this is just my interpretation. Y'all have yours, and I can't wait to hear it. So roll it.
Man, if you're looking for action, man, Houston, the town.
What do you want to do, Prince? You want to talk about women, get drunk, or you want to play some music?
I'm gonna play the Houston Slide.
That's fine.
I know Houston can't be heaven because Houston is right down here on earth.
Let's go to Big Houston, pretty girls by the dozen.
What's the matter? I'm bound to you, sweet man, falling on my knees.
Poor lightning just gotta be Houston bound.
Seems I always have to slip around to
Standing in the peacock, having a little shot of wine. Yeah, standing in the peacock, having a little shot of wine. Says, baby,
Oh, darling,
says, baby,
I love you, baby.
Tell me why, baby, why, baby, why, baby, why you make me cry, baby, cry, baby, cry, baby, cry.
Everybody singing and trucking, trucking. Everybody's swinging and trucking, 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 trucking. Everybody's doing it now.
Talk to me, talk to me.
I get high when I get to Houston.
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah, what condition my condition was in.
Texas tatted on my arm, got Houston on my back. Cause I love the city I'm from. Hands up if you feel that. Houston's how they go. That's where it's at.
And I ain't jiving when I say Houston is the action town.
I ain't jiving. Have a great day. It's all on y'all because you are the soul of Houston's music.